Hi guys, welcome to my channel. What I'm doing tonight is a podcast looking at the prediction I made for China at the beginning of 2019 and doing a little update and responding to a question that I had from a subscriber saying, was I going to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative? So I'm going to be looking at current developments in China internally and externally and talking about how they are projecting their power. So as you guys know, I do astrology predictions. This is not so much a prediction, rather an update on a prediction and how it's faring. I know I have had some comments that say, why don't I just do the damned prediction and not do the discussion? However, as a friend of mine who is a social anthropologist once said, social anthropology is all about context, context, context. And for me, that's what astrology is about. I don't see there's any point in doing the horoscope predictions if you don't provide the context to make it all make sense. So, as you know, in the beginning of the year, I said I saw synergies between what's going on in China's chart this year and with the Tiananmen Square. And as we know, although Hong Kong is not quite China, because it has certain differences in rules, it's more capitalist, we know the Hong Kong protests have been going on all year, and the Chinese authorities have been extremely restrained so far, but these have been brave and really audacious protests. It seems that people in Hong Kong are really taking up the baton as the yellow vests, but even with more courage. They just don't want to go in the same direction as China has got on, and it must be a nerve-wracking time for the communist regime in China, wondering, will this catch on? Because in my prediction, I spoke of a sleeping giant coming awake within China, where people are going to be wanting to recapture their liberty. I said one of the ways it could come about was either through the uptake of Christianity, possibly, but that people in China are very, very restless. And that restlessness is being played out in Hong Kong at the moment by the actors in Hong Kong, but it could easily spread. So what else? Why has the Chinese government been so restrained? Well, they're already very nervous because there's a big influx of people from the rural areas into the cities, and such big demographic changes of people going out of the rural into the cities can create instability, and the communist government are very, very aware of that. So they're trying to keep restraint in Hong Kong because they already feel this they're insecure. They already feel that things are beginning to change. As was talked about on Sky News yesterday and mentioned in my prediction, I said China was heading for a pensions crisis. They were talking about this on Sky with respect to the aging population, and that by 2050, I think about a third, or it'll be in the article that I come to just now, a third of the population will be pensioners, which means pensions have to be paid, blah, blah, blah. I think that particular problem is one we're facing in the West as well, but I've long said you can't treat pensions as a pyramid scheme. It's not sustainable to have an ever-growing population to prop up the older generations. We have to look at another way. They've also talked about the fact that although the one-child policy has now been dropped, there's a lack of desire within young couples to have more than one children because of the cost and because of the fact that personal debt in China is very, very high. Even though their national debt isn't a problem, personal debt is, and that could play into people's decision not to have more children and therefore to prop up the population. Also, as people move to the cities and don't stay in the towns, they're far less likely to have children because city dwellers, townies, much more likely to have fewer kids. So I think why China, they've been cracking down really hard on the Muslim population. Obviously, you've seen the stories of a million Muslims in re-education camps in China, and they are nervous about the role of Christianity and Islam because they realize that when people are answering to a higher power, it gives them courage and it undermines man-made law and man-made power. It just gives people another spiritual sense of courage to draw on. And it's known that the CIA used Christianity by Pope John Paul II, who was from Poland, and by the Greek Orthodox Church to help break the Soviet Union down, which they did with the help of the Chernobyl disaster. Not that I'm saying they caused it, the CIA caused that, but that helped bring the Soviet Union down and wake people up. So China are well aware of the threat that religion can pose to the hegemonic power that they have over the people. So that's why there's very big crackdown on that. I also said in my prediction that the health of the nation was declining in China, and that was having an impact on productivity. That hasn't been reported on, but it's something that I would say is a dynamic that's going on as well. So internally, the Chinese Communist Party are very, very jumpy. However, externally, they really are projecting their power. Dr. Steve Turley on his channel was talking about a Portuguese, I think he was a Brazilian Portuguese economist, who was talking about the 3 types of globalization. There's Chinese globalization, which I'm going to talk about with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative. There's Islamic globalization, which is obviously the ideology of Islam and the religion becoming stronger and projecting power outwards into regions where it currently doesn't have influence. And then neoliberal globalism of the type we saw in the EU, although with Brexit and what's going on in the EU and also with the defeat of Hillary, that's kind of lost its power, that form of globalism. So another thing that I wanted to talk about is China. They're now using Cambodia as a place to build airfields for their military aircraft, so they're extending their power westwards. Now, what a lot of people will say to you is that China has never been a country that invaded. And I'll say to you, why would we always think that wars are going to be fought the same as the last war? The wars that will be fought in the next century, or this century, should I say, are going to be totally different. And there are many ways to skin a cat. You don't need to go into battle to project power aggressively in order to take over, to extend your control. And I'm going to explain how China are slowly taking over, but in a totally peaceful way. And yet it's incredibly effective, doesn't garner a lot of headlines in the news, and so people don't even think about it. It'll be almost sleepwalking into Chinese control. So while the media are obsessed with what's going on with Trump's impeachment, with Brexit, with the things they're obsessed at, 50 genders or whatever the flavor of the day is, China is stealthily increasing its power. I believe there's a Cold War going on in South America where neoliberalism is being pushed, like in Bolivia. We recently had the coup where the leader, who was a more Maduro, Castro-style leader, was removed. In Chile, we've had the protests trying to overthrow what is a neoliberal regime in Chile. So there's a battle between neoliberalism and communism going on in South America, and the communist is being pushed by China. I might come to that later. So I think the Chinese is funding hard left leaders in South America to increase their power there as well, just as the USSR did in Africa in the 70s and 80s. So let's have a look, before we get into the Belt and Road, at something that was going on in Australia. So there were calls in Australia for them to take a harder line on China, following allegations that China was trying to install a candidate in a federal parliament. So a defecting Chinese spy, he's now turned whistleblower, he revealed these allegations to 60 Minutes and also to the Sydney Morning Herald. So he says there was a Victorian car dealer, Nick, and he was bankrolled by a Chinese espionage ring to run as a Liberal Party MP. Now, their Liberal Party is somewhat like our Conservatives in the UK. So this was reported to Australia's spy agency, and the next thing, the spy was found dead in a Melbourne hotel room in March. So the matter is a subject of investigation, but there's an example of how China are projecting their power by trying to install candidates. Now, a lot of Chinese students come over to study in the US, also in the UK. It was said by an expert on the Mike Graham show that many or even most of Chinese students that study overseas will have been briefed by the Communist Party. They may be active part of it, family may be part of the Chinese Communist Party, or maybe they co-opted. But when they come to study in the West, they're seen as potential spies who could maybe infiltrate government or other agencies after their studies. China own Hollywood. China own a lot of universities in America. So you can see how they can control the narrative through the entertainment world and also through the academic world, how they can suppress criticism of their regime, the one-party state, their brand of communism, all the atrocities and human rights going on. It's very easy to suppress. So as I mentioned before, China, of course, is getting old. By 2050, they'll have 487 million pensioners, which represents more than a third of the population. Now, that's going to pose a major challenge for China. Now, similar challenges were experienced by Japan and other developed Asian economies, but they were wealthier than China at the same point, and obviously it wasn't on the scale of billions of people. So when you look at the movement from the towns to cities, the aging population, declining productivity because of the health, and also the large individual debt, and the problems that are continuing to go on in Hong Kong, they don't seem to be able to douse that down. You can see there are lots of reasons for the Chinese government to be jittery internally. However, externally, they're getting stronger and stronger. And that is why I want to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'd like to credit the Trumpet magazine for some of this information. And I will leave a link to their article below this so that you guys can read it as well. So, all over the world, there are major infrastructure projects underway, which I say is quite appropriate because Uranus in Taurus, every time Uranus is in Taurus, masses of building. Taurus, of course, is a sign of the builder. Uranus is innovation and new, so there's new building everywhere, new infrastructure everywhere. Why is this important? Let's look at some examples. In Pakistan, there's a new deep water port being linked to a vast road and rail network. In Montenegro, here in Europe, the country's first border-to-border motorway is being laid. And even in the remotest part of Kazakhstan, a new town is springing up from scratch near a massive rail terminal. In Laos, which is down near Cambodia, there's a new bridge. In Rwanda, a new railway is connecting the landlocked country to Tanzania's port of Dar es Salaam. So, the common factor in all these infrastructure projects is China. So in 2013, President Xi Jinping mentioned the ancient Silk Road. So the Silk Road, of course, was a network of trade routes running across Central Asia, some established as early as 200 BC, and that was all about facilitating movement of people and goods. And he said he wanted to rebuild that ancient network. This is a way that China are projecting power. It facilitates trade, consolidates their influence. So China certainly put this into plan. 60 nations are involved in it. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. So the land-based belt, that's the belt, and the maritime section, the sea routes and the canals, that's the road. So when it's finished, it will link 60% of the global population. It'll span 3 continents, including Latin America, which is pivotal, which is why I talked about that. And it's going to cost $5 trillion. It's the most ambitious infrastructure venture in history. And it's the way China intends to dominate world trade. So how do they do it? Well, they target governments who are very authoritarian and obviously corrupt. So the allure of China's loans and their aid, very enticing to governments in developing countries, in countries that are not particularly sophisticated or in crisis, or where they have a lot of internal turmoil, for example. So countries like the USA and other European nations usually put conditions on aid, like there has to be a stable government, good on human rights, low corruption. But China, they're an egregious abuse of human rights themselves. They've got no concern about autocrats and authoritarian regimes in other nations who terrorize their people. So the West, they might, kind of lecture other governments and want to punish them by withholding aid. But when they step back, China step in. And China has no compunction about constructing airports for tyrants, for dictators, for plutocrats. It doesn't matter whether it's dams, rail terminals, rail links, they will build them. So China is now a major funder of infrastructure projects, and it's been welcomed in by most developing countries because it is flexible and less bureaucratic than the West. Let's look at some concrete examples. There's the extension of the Southern Expressway in Sri Lanka. So because China have signed these contracts with numerous authoritarian governments and military regimes, including the world's most corrupt nations, including Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and they don't draw a line there because they also go into countries like Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, where in some cases there's no government at all, because all the corruption and the conflict make it very unlikely that these nations will ever be able to repay the loans. So, for example, in early 2018, the Center for Global Development found that Djibouti, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, the Maldives, Mongolia, Montenegro, Pakistan and Tajikistan were all at a high risk of being unable to pay. But that's actually good news for China. So why do they hand out such massive loans to such nations? Well, because their policy is not just about economics. They call it, well, some call it death trap diplomacy. I call it international loan sharking. Or you could even call it like a mafia arrangement where you make an offer you can't refuse, and after that you're in hock to the mafia for the rest of your life. Well, I mentioned Sri Lanka, so they accepted billions of dollars in loans for a project called the Magampura Mahinda Rajapaksa port in Hambantota. So this port is a key location for China's maritime road. You know, the road is a maritime, the belt is the roads. But instead of fueling growth for the port, it plunged Sri Lanka into unsustainable debt. So it was great for China. It wasn't good for the people of Sri Lanka, was it? But anyway, by 2016, one third, believe this, of Sri Lanka's total government revenue went towards servicing Chinese loans, and the country was forced to apply for debt relief from the International Monetary Fund. And can you see there how the IMF are going to have to bail them out? So the IMF are essentially paying for infrastructure to suit China. Plus, it's off the back of the Sri Lankan taxpayer, who are paying in their taxes, when a third of their taxes are going towards funding these Chinese loans for this port, which is not bringing economic prosperity to Sri Lanka. There's also Pakistan's Gwadar port, which is a multi-billion-dollar development with China as well. So, when pressure intensified in Sri Lanka, the only course of action they could pursue was to hand China a controlling stake in the port for 99 years. So that really set off alarm bells in Sri Lanka and beyond, because it represented a victory for the Chinese with a lot of military applications. Because suddenly, China's got a deep water port in that region where it can dock its navy off the coast of one of its key competitors, India. You can see what a shrewd chess game this is, can't you? So Sri Lanka is often cited as a textbook example of what I call international loan sharking. So what about the East African nation of Djibouti? They're hosting China's first overseas military base. But the company's also borrowed a stack of Chinese money. It can't pay it back. It's headed towards a debt to GDP ratio of 88%. Can you see the corruption involved here? The politicians obviously get very rich, as do their cohorts, their advisors, all the add-ons who going to benefit from the scheme. And China benefit. The taxpayers don't, and the general community in the country don't benefit. So analysts are very worried that China will use the growing leverage it has to convince Djibouti to oust the United States military from Camp Lemonnier, which is America's only permanent military base in Africa. And such a move would represent a huge loss for America, and again, a major victory for China. So tell me this is not a massive invasion or a war strategy. It is. It's a coordinated takeover of assets and infrastructure. And you have to remember as well, China is recolonizing southern Africa, between South Africa, Botswana, Southwest Africa, particularly when it comes to mining. And what not a lot of people realize is that there are certain minerals that are only available in South Africa and in Russia, and those minerals are absolutely vital to the aviation industry and many others. So once you lose control of those minerals, it's effectively the West being held to ransom, because China could just shut those off. I'm thinking that Russia is a key ally of China, so that they might work alongside China to limit those minerals, to make the West more vulnerable, or to cripple it. So let's have a look at Pakistan. There we have Chinese infrastructure, I was mentioning it before, stretching all the way from Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea up to the Pakistan-China border. So this isn't just a crossroads where belt meets the road, i.e. the road meets the maritime route. It's also helping China safeguard against their big fear, which is a potential US naval blockade in the South China Sea. Because now China's got an alternative route for importing goods, particularly oil and gas from the Middle East, which they are heavily dependent on. So China also owes China more than $6 billion. It's paying exorbitant interest rates on some of the loans. And again, you can see that's going to give China leverage. And they actually have already taken control of Gwadar port with a 40-year lease, and now they can control it. So again, it's all on the back of the Pakistani workers. They losing the state assets they paid for. It's all helping China to their global dominance. Another one is the Maldives. They heavily indebted to China, thanks mostly to a multi-million-dollar friendship bridge, so-called, and they'll soon have no choice but to hand key assets over to China. But it's coming closer into Europe. In Montenegro, they had these feasibility studies that said it wasn't economically viable to build a highway from the port of Bar through the nation to the kind of tough terrain of the nation to Serbia. But in 2014, China threw away those studies. They stepped in, gave Montenegro a loan, and now they've built a long stretch of that road. The motorway's unfinished, but already Montenegro is in serious financial trouble. And in the situation that they pay out like Sri Lanka did, then they'll get the 99-year lease, and Beijing will have a port of entry into Europe from the Adriatic. Can you see how they're building their invasion strategy? Do you know that for many years China has been buying up deep-sea ports and canals? They control the Panama Canal, they control major deep ports in Athens. So, as I say, just think of the chess pieces. Just now we're going to be checkmated and no one's even thinking about it. Latin America is also a natural extension of the Silk Road. For example, Panama, Antigua and Barbuda, Trinidad and Tobago and Bolivia have already signed on to the scheme, and many more countries are poised to follow. As will be the same vein with the BRI, there'll be infrastructure financing and development. The next thing, there'll be debt repayment problems, and China will just simply step in, take over the assets, and, hey presto, they are in. So, I thought it might be very interesting to analyze all that. So, while things are a little bit shaky, and they're getting nervy about what's going on internally, they're projecting their power extremely effectively externally, while the rest of the world is totally asleep. So, I'll be interested to see what will happen internally, because at this point, the only out the West have is to collapse China internally. And I'm talking about this because it's a competitive world. We have competing ideologies. I wouldn't be on the Chinese team because I'm against communism and I'm against that ideology. And I think a lot of the initiatives the Chinese are making, it's their own imperialism rather than what's of benefit for the Chinese people. And for the Chinese people, they're becoming increasingly a controlled, regimented society. And conditions will not necessarily remain good for them, even if they remain fantastic for the Communist Party. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops. I hope you enjoyed that little update. I hope everyone's had a fantastic Christmas. I've got quite a few more podcasts coming on slightly different subjects. I've got the death of Missouri, I've got Prince Andrew, and I've got some things on the future of Australia and climate change.